Good morning. It's very nice to be here. My wife and I arrived here yesterday afternoon, and we saw a wonderful exhibition. In fact, if you haven't seen it, I would urge you. It's an exhibition of Ruth Weisberg. She has two of them, as some of you may know. One is at the Jack Rutberg Gallery, which we went to last night, and the second one, which we hope to see before we leave, is at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, which is one of the great museums anywhere. Anyway, when I finish, I'll be happy to answer questions. We're not supposed to leave Los Angeles until Sunday, so we have plenty of time. One of the questions that I get fairly often from artists is, how do you get an exhibition in New York? And that's a complicated question, and it's a question that I ask artists: how'd you get your first exhibition in New York? And one of the favorite answers that I got was from an artist named Philip Pearlstein, who you may have heard. He's been around for a number of years. He's had exhibitions in galleries and museums all over the world. And Philip told me that when he was a youngster, he came to New York, a total unknown, with his buddy Andy Warhol. And one day, Clement Greenberg, who was then one of the most powerful art critics in the country, was curating an exhibition at a local gallery in New York. And he picked Philip Pearlstein, again, a total unknown, for this exhibition. Well, everybody else in this exhibition was a star or a superstar. Artists like Jack Tworkov, who was much better known in those days than he is now, and others. And so Pearlstein could never understand why there appeared a review in a magazine. It wasn't ARTnews. This goes back many years. It was a magazine called Art International, which ceased publication some years ago. And it was a two-page spread. And Pearlstein, the only unknown in the show, his painting was reproduced about the size of a half page. The others, the stars and the superstars, their paintings were reproduced about the size of a postage stamp, and he couldn't understand why. And one day he ran into the guy who was the managing editor of the publication, who was an alcoholic. And he asked him, "How come you picked me?" And he says, "I'll tell you why I picked you. I'd been fired from the magazine because of my drinking." He said, "I was so ticked off at the art world, I wanted to pick the ugliest goddamn painting in the show." Well, anyway, he said as a result of that, he got a one-person show in New York, and he took off from there. Anyway, as Ruth said, I started I was always interested in theater and art ever since I was a youngster. I was born in New York, and actually I started at the paper as a copy boy while I was still, I just started going to Brooklyn College. In fact, unfortunately, I shouldn't mention it here, but I'm a dropout. But in any case, and so my first day on the job, they had told me, as you know, working as a copy boy at the New York Times, one of the most distinguished newspapers in the world, is a great way to learn how to be a reporter and taking it from there. So I didn't find my first day very encouraging for a career in journalism, because my first chore was to go into Times Square and pick up a copy of the Daily Racing Form, which was a publication giving you all kinds of tips if you were betting on horses. And I had to deliver it to the managing editor, who was a colorful guy named Edwin James. And he would place his bets every day with my boss, who was the chief copy boy. So this was my initiation into the distinguished world of journalism. At any rate, after a while, I became a reporter, and eventually I was I guess, fourth assistant junior critic and reporter in the drama department. One of my mentors, I was quite lucky, was one of the great drama critics this country ever had, a man named Brooks Atkinson. He was very kind to me and others who were just starting out in the newspaper business. And I used to review Shakespeare in the Park, off-Broadway plays, but I hated reviewing the off-Broadway plays. The Shakespeare in the Park was great because these were great productions. But the off-Broadway stuff that I was assigned to see, since I was the kid in the department, were awful stuff. And in those days, you had maybe 40 minutes to rush back to the office and write a review for the next morning's paper. And since most of it was awful, I hated to tell some poor soul that he or she was better off doing something else. I would almost pray that I would see something good, and once in a while God looked over me and I would see something good, and I was able to write a favorable review. And then I developed at the New York Times in the 60s, covering art news in depth. I'm not an art historian, I'm just an old reporter. And this had never been done at the paper before, doing investigative journalism, getting behind the scenes and interviewing the key players, the artists, the collectors, the dealers, the scholars. I was able to get stories on page one with some of these things, and this had never happened at the paper before. And then they promoted me, and I knew I couldn't buy the New York Times, and so I decided to start a brand new art magazine and do with this new brand new art magazine what I was doing at the Times. And we were cranking up, and then I heard that Newsweek magazine, which had owned ARTnews, might be interested in selling. The magazine, as many of you probably know, the magazine was started in 1902. Newsweek had bought the magazine in 1962. And you know what happens sometimes in big corporations. ARTnews was just this little itty-bitty magazine tucked away in a corner of this vast and highly successful, phenomenally successful publishing empire. They weren't paying any attention to it, and it was just drifting along. And so when I heard that they might be interested in selling, I called a friend of mine named Lester Bernstein, who was then editor of Newsweek. And you know how sometimes the world turns around? I was Lester's office boy in the drama department at the New York Times when Lester was a reporter in the drama department. And he quit the Times because they wouldn't give him a $10 raise. Again, this goes back many years ago. And it was one of the smartest things he ever did because he was a brilliant writer and began and went to Time magazine, began to do cover stories. And then Katharine Graham, who was then head of the Washington Post Newsweek empire, wooed him away to become editor of Newsweek. And so I called Lester, and he said he hadn't heard that they were interested, but he would find out, and he called me and he said, go see a guy who was then chairman of the board of the empire. And so I was fortunate. I was able to work out a deal in buying ARTnews, which was already a very distinguished art magazine in 1972, but it wasn't doing very well financially. Otherwise, you know, why would they have sold it? And in any case, at the magazine, I brought in virtually a completely new staff and began to do the things that I was doing at the New York Times, the investigative reporting, and et cetera, and covering so many of the issues in the art world. The only trouble is that it hasn't helped my tennis game, but that's another story. And so it's been quite a rewarding time for me because I've had a chance to meet some of the great artists, some of the great scholars, some of the great collectors and dealers and others all over the world. Again, as far as scholars, just to give you an idea, people like Meyer Shapiro, who was a legendary, one of the greatest art historians. He taught for many years at Columbia University. I had gotten to know Meyer when I was still a reporter at the Times. And one of the first things I did when I came to the magazine, I called him and I said, Meyer, I'd love to do a profile of you. And he says, Milton, he says, I'm flattered and I'm honored, but I'm 3 years behind on my lectures at Columbia. I'm 2 years behind on a book of my collected essays. So each year I would renew my request. Either I'd run into him somewhere at an opening or I'd call him on the phone, and each year I'd get the same story. Milton, I'm flattered and I'm honored, but I'm behind on the lecture, I'm behind on the book, etc., blah, blah, blah. And each year I would increase my offer. After 10 years, I called him and I said, Maya, I know how busy you are. You're behind on the lecture and you're behind on the book, but I'll fly in a team of scholars of your choosing, and since you're so busy, we'll only spend 2 afternoons taping, and I promise you I will not print a comma of the transcript without your approval. He says, Milton, be patient. This is after 10 years. Well, anyway, to finish the story, one day I ran into an old friend, a woman named Helen Epstein, who was then an associate professor of journalism at NYU. And she was also a brilliant writer, had done profiles, freelance profiles for the New York Times Magazine on Leonard Bernstein and others. And I told her, how would you like to do my... Oh, she'd also written a very moving book called Children of the Holocaust, in which she traveled around the world interviewing children whose parents survived the Holocaust, of which she is one. And I called Helen, and she called him, and she called me the next day. She said he was very gracious on the phone. He didn't commit himself. He asked me to send some of my articles, and he asked me to send a copy of the book. So when she told me that, I said, Helen, I think you got him, because he's going to be so moved by the book. Well, sure enough, he gave her the go-ahead, and we published in 2 parts, and as it's the only time we ever published anything in 2 parts. And as we got closer to publication date, he called me and he says, Milton, would you like to use a couple of my paintings? Now, Maya was one of the greatest art historians of the last century, but he certainly was not one of the greatest artists of the last century. But anyway, of course, we published a couple of the paintings. And so it won a prize for Helen, and it was a marvelous piece of writing. And so this is what I thought the story was, that the book that she wrote was the thing that really made the deal. A few months ago, I had lunch with Maya Shapiro's daughter, who's a professor of mathematics, a PhD at Stern College in New York, and I told her the story that I just told you. And she said, you know, the book was not the reason why he agreed to the profile. The reason was my mother. I said, tell me more. Well, she said that when Maya told my mother that ARTnews wanted to do a profile, and he was about to tell her that I'm going to turn it down because he's turned everybody else down, including the New Yorker magazine and many other publications through the years. And she said to him, Maya, it's about time you were immortalized. And so he agreed to the profile. So I said to Miriam, that's the Shapiro's daughter's name, I said, what about the paintings? She said, that was also my mother. Okay. As you know, we're a monthly magazine. We're a small staff, and most of the feature articles are done, created internally. What I mean is not necessarily by members of the staff, although some of it is done, including by me. That's one of the perks of the job, that I could still write occasionally. And whenever we have ideas that we want to assign, we have a network of correspondents around the world. Either they're reporters in specific cities, or the art historians, critics, and so on. And we have all the, for example, the reviews. We publish, of course, mainly reviews from New York, but we also cover a lot of reviews from the rest of the United States as well as overseas. In fact, that's one of the things that I started when I came to the magazine, because in those days, all the art magazines, including ARTnews, they concentrated almost exclusively on reviews from New York. And so I made it clear that, to me, one of the great stories, the developing stories in the art world, and it continues all these years and continues to all over the world, and that is that the big story is this growing decentralization of art. I mean, we've covered stories from Charlottesville, Virginia, or from Seattle, from Pakistan, you name it, and so on and so forth. There are too many people, even today, feel that the art world begins and ends in New York. It doesn't go beyond the Hudson River. Well, that, of course, that's nonsense. You have the emergence of galleries, commercial galleries. You have the emergence of university galleries, of museums all over, and so on and so forth. So that, to me, has been one of the great stories of the last few decades, the growing decentralization of art. Now, people ask me from time to time, how about the cover? When you have an artist on the cover, is that an endorsement by ARTnews? No, it's not. The fact that we have an artist on the cover of the magazine means that the artist has become a presence, has become news. He or she is having an exhibition at an important museum. He or she, for want of a better word, there's buzz about this particular artist. He or she is being collected by important collectors all over the United States. At the same time, we have departments like Artists to Watch, okay, in which we ask our critics around the country, around the world, to pick artists from time to time who they think are young and are beginning to emerge and should be encouraged. For example, a number of years ago, one of our critics picked Louise Bourgeois, who now, of course, is a superstar, but in those days was not nearly as well known as she is now. Now, another thing that we're asked from time to time is your selection of reviewers around the world. Bless you. There are lots of things that appear in ARTnews every month that I personally disagree with. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. As I've indicated, the magazine is a several-headed monster. On the one hand, you have the journalism, okay? If I don't, and our editors feel that the reporter, whoever he or she is around the world, has an agenda, and you know what I mean by that. There are too many reporters these days, not only in the arts, but in politics and every other area, in magazines, newspapers, radio, and TV, who have some kind of agenda, who are not as objective as they should be. They will not write for ARTnews. Now, as far as the reviews, that's another story. When I said there are lots of things that appear in the magazine, not lots, but some, in almost every issue. I'm talking about reviews now, that I personally disagree with. In other words, I saw the show, I thought it was great, and the critic didn't like it. Or the critic loved it, and I hated it. But if I didn't respect the honesty, the integrity, the ability to write, they wouldn't be writing for the magazine. And so that takes care as far as the reviews. Now, some of the issues that Ruth mentioned, one of the most gratifying things to me has been the series of stories that we have published beginning in 1983 and 84 about all the art that the Nazis stole from victims of the Holocaust and were hanging in museums and galleries in many countries, particularly in Europe, and some even in the United States. And we were the first to do it. The way it developed was a friend of mine named Al Elson, who was a distinguished art historian. He was a professor of art history at Stanford, former president of the College Art Association. And he called me one day and he said he had heard about this monastery outside of Vienna containing thousands of works of art that the Nazis had stolen from victims of the Holocaust. He said he didn't know whether the Austrians were to be commended or to be criticized, but he said that is something I ought to look into. And so within a month, my wife and I were on a plane to Vienna. And before I left, I called the minister in Austria in charge of these things, a guy named Gerhard Sailer, and said I'd like to see him. And so when we got there, went to his office, and he's sitting there very arrogantly. He said, "Why are you here?" Well, since I got that very cordial greeting, I knew that these guys in Europe, they like to be called Herr Doctor. And instead of calling him Herr Dr. Sailer, I said, in my usual gracious way, I said, "Mr. Sailer, as I mentioned to you on the phone, I heard about this monastery. And again, not knowing anything about it, whether it was good or bad, whether there was any scandal there. And I came here to find out more about it. And I said, when can I visit the monastery? And he pounded his fists on the desk. And he said, you cannot go. So I couldn't resist. I said, Mr. Saylor, when I was a young reporter at the New York Times, a wise old editor told me that when somebody answers a question the way you have just answered my question, that I should become suspicious that maybe you're hiding something. Well, the interview didn't get any better, and it lasted about another 2.5 minutes, and I left, and we stayed for about a week, and we found out that it was a scandal. And I would have loved to have written the story myself, but I knew it would take too much time, and so I assigned one of our young freelancers, a young man named Andrew Decker. And Andrew spent weeks in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and he came back with the story, which we put on the cover of the magazine. And the title of the piece was A Legacy of Shame. A Legacy of Shame. And this was the first time anything appeared in any publication or radio or TV about this scandal. And lots of things happened soon thereafter. The Austrian Chancellor went on TV and said, but, we're going to do something, and so on and so forth. Well, they didn't do anything for nearly 10 years. And for nearly 10 years, we were the only publication in the world. This is a fact. The record is there. There were other publications occasionally writing about it, but we were the only publication in the world that kept after the Austrians. In fact, a year after the first story appeared, I was attacked by one of Austria's leading magazines. They had a big story saying that the reason Esterow went to Austria and the reason ARTnews published the story is because Mr. Esterow has a claim on some of these paintings in the monastery.